Judge laughs at disabled veteran in court, but has no idea who's about to walk in. The Jefferson County Courthouse stood imposingly against the gray October sky, its weathered limestone facade having witnessed generations of justice and injustice alike. Inside courtroom 3B, the morning light filtered weakly through tall windows, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air like silent witnesses to the proceedings below. Michael Winters sat alone at the defendant's table, his weathered hands one flesh and blood the other, absent resting on the polished wood. At 68, his once powerful frame had diminished, but his posture remained military straight, despite the pain that radiated constantly from his damaged spine. The empty right sleeve of his navy blazer was neatly pinned, a visual testament to what he had sacrificed in the jungles of Vietnam half a century earlier. A purple heart pin adorned his lapel, the only outward indication of his service beyond his injuries. Life had not been kind to Michael since his return from war. After losing his arm and sustaining severe damage to his leg from an enemy grenade, he had struggled through decades of PTSD, multiple surgeries, and the slow erosion of his health. His wife, Sarah, had stood by him through the worst years before cancer took her 5 years ago. Their only son had been killed in Afghanistan in 2010. Now, Michael lived alone in a modest apartment, subsisting on his military pension and disability benefits, finding purpose in occasionally mentoring young veterans at the local VA center. The eviction notice had arrived 3 months ago, coinciding precisely with the VA's transition to a new digital payment system that had inexplicably halted his benefits without warning. Despite his perfect 7-year history as a tenant, despite his desperate calls to the VA, despite showing his property manager documentation of the administrative era, Evergreen Properties had proceeded with eviction. Today would determine whether he would have a home tomorrow. Across the aisle, 3 attorneys in expensive suits represented Evergreen Properties, their leather portfolios and digital tablets forming a wall of corporate efficiency. They barely glanced at the elderly veteran, having processed dozens of similar evictions in recent months, since the company had been acquired by a private equity firm. Judge Walter Preston entered the courtroom with the confident stride of a man accustomed to power. At 52, his silver-streaked hair and tailored robes projected authority, though whispers throughout the legal community suggested his appointment had more to do with political connections than judicial aptitude. He was known for running an efficient courtroom efficiency that often came at the expense of compassion. Case number 2347B, Evergreen Properties versus Michael Winters, the bailiff announced. Judge Preston glanced at the file, then at Michael, his expression revealing a momentary flash of annoyance at seeing an unrepresented defendant, another delay in his carefully scheduled day. "Mr. Winters, do you have counsel today?" the judge asked, though the answer was obvious. Michael stood slowly, leaning heavily on his cane. "No, Your Honor. I couldn't afford an attorney, but I've prepared some documents explaining my situation. If the court would..." "The court is aware of your situation." "Mr. Winters," Preston interrupted, "you've failed to pay rent for 3 months. Do you dispute this fact?" "No, Your Honor, but there were extenuating circumstances. The VA had a processing error with my disability benefits, and Judge Preston's dismissive chuckle cut through the courtroom like a knife. "Mr. Winters, this court hears a lot of excuses, administrative errors, lost checks, medical emergencies. The list goes on. But a lease agreement is a binding contract. Michael stood straighter, his dignity evident despite his frail appearance. "Sir, I've never missed a payment in 7 years until this issue. I have documentation from the VA confirming the error and showing that my back payments have now been processed. I can pay what I owe. I just need a little more time." The judge leaned back in his chair, making no effort to hide his skepticism. "So, you're asking this court to force a legitimate business to serve as your personal bank while government bureaucracy sorts itself out? That's not how the real world works, Mr. Winters." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Even the court reporter paused momentarily, her fingers hovering above her stenotype machine. "With all due respect, Your Honor." Michael replied, his voice quiet but steady. "I believe I understand how the real world works. I lost my arm and the full use of my leg in service to this country. I've worked every day I physically could since coming home. I'm not asking for charity, just for the same consideration any citizen deserves." Judge Preston's face darkened. "Mr. Winters, your military service, while appreciated, is not relevant to these proceedings. This is a simple matter of contract law. The court is not interested in emotional appeals." Then, in a moment that would later be replayed on news stations across the country, the judge added with a smirk, "The world doesn't owe you special treatment because you're a veteran, Mr. Winters. We all have our hardships." The courtroom fell silent. Even the attorneys for Evergreen Properties looked uncomfortable, the lead counsel shifting papers unnecessarily while avoiding eye contact with her client. Michael's face remained impassive, though something in his eyes dimmed. He had faced enemy fire with less fear than this moment of public humiliation. Slowly, he reached into his jacket pocket and removed a folded paper, the letter from the VA confirming his benefits had been restored and back payments processed. "Your Honor, I only ask that you review this documentation before making your decision." Judge Preston sighed theatrically. "Hand it to the bailiff." As the bailiff approached to take the document, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a decisive thud. All heads turned as a commanding figure in a crisp military dress uniform entered. The medals and insignia on his chest caught the light, creating an almost ethereal effect as he moved with measured steps down the center aisle. 4 stars adorned each shoulder of his uniform, the insignia of a full general in the United States Army. Judge Preston's smirk vanished, replaced by confusion and then dawning recognition. General James Harrington, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and one of the most decorated military officers of his generation, approached the bar. His presence seemed to fill the entire courtroom, his authority undeniable even in this civilian setting. "Permission to address the court, Your Honor." The general's voice was calm but carried to every corner of the suddenly silent room. Judge Preston, visibly flustered, managed to nod. Yes, of course, General Harrington. This is unexpected." The general turned slightly, acknowledging Michael Winters with a respectful nod before facing the judge again. "I apologize for the interruption, Your Honor, but when I heard about these proceedings, I felt compelled to attend. You see, Sergeant Michael Winters served under my command during one of the most brutal campaigns of the Vietnam War. The arm he lost it pulling me and 2 other soldiers to safety, after our position was overrun. The general's gaze hardened as he continued, "The Medal of Honor that President Nixon placed around his neck was earned that day. The same medal that sits in a display case at the Pentagon as a reminder of what true courage looks like." Judge Preston's face had drained of color. I was unaware of Mr. Winters' specific service record." "Clearly," the general replied, his tone measured but unmistakably cold. "Perhaps if the court would permit, I have some information that might be relevant to these proceedings." Behind the general, more figures entered the courtroom. A woman in a crisp business suit, a man with the unmistakable bearing of a high-ranking government official, and several military officers in full-dress uniform. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted palpably, the power dynamic altering with each new arrival. The lead attorney for Evergreen Properties rose hastily. "Your Honor, given these unexpected developments, my client would like to request a brief recess to confer." "Denied," Judge Preston said, finding his voice again. "General Harrington, please continue." The general nodded to an aide who stepped forward with a leather portfolio. "First, Your Honor, I have here documentation from the Department of Veterans Affairs acknowledging the systematic error that affected Sergeant Winters' benefits, along with confirmation that all back payments have now been processed." The documents were handed to the judge, who examined them with newfound attentiveness. Additionally, the general continued, "Our legal team at the Pentagon has identified several clauses in Evergreen Properties leasing agreement that appear to violate the Service Member Civil Relief Act, particularly regarding the accelerated eviction of veterans with service-connected disabilities." The lead attorney for Evergreen Properties shot to her feet. "Your Honor, these allegations are completely unfounded. My client has followed all applicable laws in this matter." "Has your client?" The woman in the business suit stepped forward. "Your Honor, I'm Sarah Lockhart, Deputy Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Our department has received multiple complaints regarding Evergreen Properties' treatment of veteran tenants since their acquisition by Platinum Investments last year." Judge Preston, now visibly sweating, looked between the high-ranking officials and the corporate attorneys. The simple eviction case had transformed into something far more consequential, with national implications and his own reputation suddenly at stake. "This is highly irregular," he stammered. "This court cannot be expected to adjudicate policy matters in what should be a straightforward eviction proceeding." General Harrington's expression remained impassive. "Your Honor, there is nothing straightforward about evicting a Medal of Honor recipient due to an acknowledged government error, particularly when that eviction potentially violates federal law." The courtroom had grown increasingly crowded as word spread through the courthouse. Journalists had begun to filter in phones recording the unprecedented scene. Judge Preston was acutely aware that his earlier dismissive comments about Michael's military service had likely been captured for posterity. In a desperate attempt to regain control, Preston addressed the Evergreen attorneys. "Counsel, given this new information, what is your client's position?" The lead attorney conferred hurriedly with her colleagues, then stood. "Your Honor, in light of these revelations, Evergreen Properties would be willing to work out a payment plan with Mr. Winters and withdraw the eviction notice as a one-time accommodation." "A one-time accommodation?" General Harrington's voice carried a dangerous edge. I think you misunderstand the situation. This isn't about one veteran. This is about a pattern of behavior that appears to systematically disadvantage those who have served this country. The attorney paled. I'm not authorized to make broader commitments on behalf of my client, General. Then perhaps your client should be present for these discussions, the General suggested. I understand Mr. Trevor Harrington is the new regional manager for Evergreen Properties. Any relation to Judge Preston's golf partner, Charles Harrington? I wonder. A shocked murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Preston's face flushed deep red. That insinuation is inappropriate and irrelevant, he snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. Michael Winters had remained silent throughout this exchange, watching with a mixture of confusion and disbelief as high-ranking officials fought battles on his behalf that he had long ago resigned himself to losing alone. Now he slowly rose to his feet, his movement drawing all eyes in the courtroom. Your Honor, he said quietly, I never wanted to cause this much trouble. I just wanted to keep my home while the VA sorted out their mistake. I've lived in that apartment for 7 years. It's where Sarah and I spent our last days together. It's where I keep my son's medals from Afghanistan. I can pay what I owe now the VA has fixed their error. I just needed a little time and a little dignity. The simple eloquence of his words hung in the air, a stark contrast to the legal and political maneuvering that had overtaken the proceedings. For the first time, Judge Preston seemed to truly see the man standing before him not as a case number or an inconvenience, but as a human being who had given everything for his country and asked for little in return. General Harrington moved to stand beside Michael, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder. Sergeant Winters exemplifies the best of what our nation produces: courage, resilience, and humility. 50 years ago, he dragged me to safety while bleeding from wounds that would forever alter his life. He never asked for recognition then, and he isn't asking for special treatment now. He's asking for justice. The general turned to address the courtroom at large. What happens in this courtroom today matters beyond this case. It speaks to how we as a nation honor our commitments to those who have served. It speaks to whether the sacrifices made by men like Sergeant Winters are truly valued or merely acknowledged with pins and parades before being dismissed when inconvenient. Judge Preston sat motionless, the weight of the moment and the cameras capturing it pressing upon him. Finally, he cleared his throat. This court will take a 30-minute recess. Counsel for Evergreen Properties, I suggest you use this time to contact your client and secure appropriate authorization. General Harrington, Ms. Lockhart, I would appreciate it if you would join me in chambers. As the judge rose and the courtroom began to buzz with excited conversation, Michael found himself surrounded by supportive figures, the general, various officials, and even ordinary citizens who had been in court for other matters, but had stayed to witness the extraordinary proceedings. I don't understand, Michael said quietly to General Harrington. How did you know about my case? The general smiled slightly. I make it a point to visit VA facilities regularly. I was at the regional office yesterday when you were there trying to sort out your benefits. One of the staff recognized you and mentioned your eviction hearing. The rest, as they say, is history. But why go to all this trouble for me? Not just for you, Mike, the general replied. For every veteran who doesn't have a general to walk into court on their behalf, What happened to you is happening across the country. Veterans facing eviction, foreclosure, and financial ruin because of systemic failures in the very systems designed to support them. Your case just happened to provide the perfect opportunity to bring these issues to light. When court resumed 30 minutes later, the atmosphere had changed dramatically. The judge's demeanor was subdued. The Evergreen attorneys looked distinctly uncomfortable, and several new faces had joined the proceedings, including the CEO of Platinum Investments, who had apparently been reached on his yacht and strongly encouraged to participate via video conference. Judge Preston addressed the court with a markedly different tone than he had used earlier. Having reviewed the additional evidence presented and consulted with the relevant parties, this court is prepared to rule on this matter. However, before I do so, I understand that Evergreen Properties wishes to make a statement. The lead attorney stood. Yes, Your Honor, my client has authorized me to announce that Evergreen Properties will be implementing a new company-wide policy regarding veteran tenants effective immediately. This policy will include extended grace periods for VA benefit recipients experiencing administrative delays, a dedicated liaison officer for veteran concerns, and a commitment to full compliance with not just the letter, but the spirit of the Service Members Civil Relief Act. She paused, then continued with visible reluctance. Additionally, Evergreen Properties will be establishing a foundation to assist veterans facing housing insecurity with an initial endowment of $5 million. And of course, Mr. Winter's eviction notice is withdrawn with all late fees waived and a formal apology extended. Murmurs of approval rippled through the courtroom. Judge Preston nodded, then turned to Michael. Mr. Winters, this court owes you an apology as well. Your service and sacrifice should never have been dismissed, and your request for basic consideration while resolving a government error was entirely reasonable. This case is dismissed with prejudice against the plaintiff. The judge paused, then added more quietly, and speaking personally, I thank you for your service to our nation. It has been a privilege to have you in my courtroom today. As the proceedings concluded and people began to file out, Michael found himself at the center of attention. Reporters requesting interviews, veterans advocates offering support, and ordinary citizens simply wanting to shake his hand. Through it all, he maintained the quiet dignity that had characterized his entire life. General Harrington remained by his side, deflecting the most intrusive questions and ensuring Michael wasn't overwhelmed. As they finally exited the courthouse together, the general asked, "What will you do now, Mike?" Michael considered the question, looking out at the autumn leaves swirling across the courthouse steps. "I think I'll spend more time at the VA Center. There are a lot of young veterans who need someone who understands what they're going through. Maybe what happened today can help others somehow." The general nodded approvingly. The best of us never stop serving, do they? That evening, as Michael returned to the apartment that remained his home, he found a package waiting at his door, a shadow box containing his Medal of Honor, which he had donated to the Pentagon Museum years ago. Attached was a note in General Harrington's precise handwriting, "This belongs with you, not behind glass." Some sacrifices should be remembered daily, not just by institutions, but by the nation they preserved. The President sends his regards and would like to meet with you next month regarding a new veterans housing initiative. Michael's hands trembled as he hung the shadow box on his living room wall, the first military memento he had displayed in his home since Sarah's passing. She had always kept his medals polished and prominently displayed, proud of the man she had married. After her death, he had packed them away, the memories too painful to confront daily. In the weeks that followed, Michael's life transformed in ways he could never have anticipated. The media coverage of the courtroom confrontation had gone viral, with millions sharing video clips of the general's entrance and the judge's humbling reversal. Veterans advocacy groups reached out asking Michael to speak at events. Law schools requested his participation in discussions about legal protections for veterans. Most significantly, the Department of Veterans Affairs announced a comprehensive review of their benefits processing system, with Michael invited to serve on the Civilian Oversight Committee. The administrative error that had nearly cost him his home had apparently affected thousands of other veterans nationwide, many without the resources or support to fight eviction proceedings. Evergreen properties facing intense public scrutiny and the threat of federal investigation underwent a dramatic restructuring. The private equity firm that had acquired them sold their interest under pressure from shareholders. The new management team, which included 2 veterans in senior positions, implemented the promised reforms and expanded them, creating a model that other housing companies began to emulate. Judge Preston announced his retirement 6 months later, citing a desire to reflect on the true meaning of justice. Court records would show that in his final months on the bench, his rulings in cases involving veterans and other vulnerable populations reflected a newfound compassion and attention to circumstance rather than rigid adherence to legal technicalities. 1 year to the day after the courthouse confrontation, Michael stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., addressing the inaugural conference of the National Veterans Housing Alliance, an organization born directly from the events of his case. Behind him sat General Harrington, now retired, but still commanding respect, alongside legislators, advocates, and hundreds of veterans whose lives had been touched by the reforms sparked by one elderly veteran's quiet dignity in the face of injustice. "I never sought to be a symbol or start a movement," Michael told the assembled crowd, his voice stronger than it had been in years. "I just wanted to keep my home while a mistake was corrected." But what happened that day in court revealed a truth we sometimes forget, that justice isn't just about laws and contracts. It's about recognizing the humanity in each other, about understanding that behind every case number is a person with a story. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces, some in uniform, others bearing the visible and invisible scars of service. "When I lost my arm in Vietnam, I thought I had given my country the biggest sacrifice I could offer. I was wrong. The greatest sacrifice would have been losing faith in the principles I fought to defend. Thanks to the actions of General Harrington and so many others who stood up that day, my faith was not just preserved, it was strengthened." Michael gestured to a young female veteran in the front row, a prosthetic leg visible beneath her skirt. "Because of what happened that day, Jessica here didn't lose her apartment when her benefits were delayed. Because of what happened that day, thousands of veterans have been protected from eviction while administrative errors are corrected." His voice grew softer, more reflective. "My wife, Sarah, used to tell me that no act of courage is ever wasted, even when it seems no one notices." I think about that often now. I think about how General Harrington never forgot the actions of a young sergeant 50 years ago, and how that memory sparked a moment of courage in a courtroom that has changed countless lives. As Michael concluded his speech to thunderous applause, he felt a profound sense of peace. The journey from that humiliating moment in court to this podium had been unexpected and sometimes overwhelming, but it had given new purpose to his remaining years and meaning to the sacrifices of his youth. Later that evening, at a small private reception, General Harrington raised a toast. To Michael Winters, he said, who reminds us that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism happen not on battlefields, but in ordinary moments when one person refuses to surrender their dignity, and in doing so, helps preserve the dignity of us all. Michael returned to his apartment that night, the same apartment he had nearly lost, and sat for a long time looking at the shadow box containing his Medal of Honor. Next to it now hung a new frame containing the front page of the Washington Post from the day after the court hearing with the headline, "General Confronts Judge Over Veterans Treatment Sparks National Reform." He thought about how life's most significant turning points often come disguised as its darkest moments. He thought about Sarah and how proud she would have been. He thought about his son, whose sacrifice in Afghanistan now seemed connected to this unexpected new chapter in ways he couldn't fully articulate but deeply felt. And he thought about that moment when the courtroom doors had swung open and General Harrington had walked in. How in that instant everything had changed, not because of who Michael was or what he had done, but because someone with power had chosen to use that power to stand beside someone without it. The world doesn't owe you special treatment because you're a veteran, the judge had sneered. He had been right in a way. The world didn't owe anyone special treatment, but it did owe everyone basic dignity and justice, and sometimes it took a general walking into a courtroom to remind the world of that fundamental truth. Michael Winters slept peacefully that night, secure in his home and in the knowledge that his life's journey had taken an unexpected turn toward a purpose greater than he could have imagined. The arm he had lost in Vietnam had, in a way he could never have foreseen, reached across decades to save not just his home, but the homes of countless others who would never know his name but would benefit from his stand. Sometimes justice arrives in unexpected ways, and sometimes it walks through the door just when you need it most.